Hello, I'm here with the Ghost of Emmett Till, who's haunted me for a while now. He's asked me very politely if I would be his voice to you today, since his voice was taken from him. In 1941, an American woman named Mamie Till gave birth to a boy named Emmett Till. He lived in Chicago. A month after Emmett turned 14, his uncle Moses Wright, who was a preacher, came to Chicago for a family visit, as we all love to do in this fine country. At the end of the visit, Emmett begged his mom to let him go visit his cousins, and so Mamie let Emmett travel to the town of Money, Mississippi. She kissed her boy, and she saw the life in his 14-year-old eyes for the last time. He made it to Money, Mississippi on Sunday, August 21st. That Wednesday, the 24th, he and his cousins skipped church where his Uncle Moses was preaching.
And they met up with some local kids at Bryant's Grocery and Meat Market. The kids have been sharecroppers. They've been picking cotton all day long in 1955. The market's owned by a white couple, 24-year-old husband and a 21-year-old wife. The wife was alone at the store that day because the husband was away. He was hauling shrimp to Texas. The facts are murky, but if you dig into it, you'll find reports that Emmett had a photograph of an integrated classroom. He was bragging to the other kids that the white kids in the picture were his friends, and that one of the white girls was his girlfriend. So of course the other boys dared him to go talk to the 21-year-old white lady in the store who was running it. 4 days later, 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning, her husband and his brother, the lady at the market, showed up to Moses Wright's home, and they snatched that little boy out of his uncle's house. They tied him up, and they threw him in the back of their pickup truck. They pistol whipped him on the way to a barn, where they beat him and they mutilated his body and his face. They threw him back in the pickup truck, and they drove to a cotton gin, where they stole a 70-pound metal fan. They threw that in the back of the pickup truck with them, and they drove to the Tallahatchie River. They stripped his clothes off, and they used barbed wire to tie his neck to that 70-pound fan. And then they shot him in the head, and they threw him away in that river. 3 days later, his broken, naked, mutilated body was found in that river. I'm not going to describe the terror that his family went through that night and the days after searching for him, as I'm sure you can imagine it. The Mississippi authorities tried to immediately bury Emmett Till in Mississippi. They had his body clothed, they packed it in lime, and they placed him in a pine coffin. His mother, Mamie Till, had to call several local and state authorities in both Illinois and Mississippi to halt his burial and to get her baby's bloated, broken body back. At the funeral home in Chicago, you could smell Emmett Till's body from 2 blocks away. Mamie called for her son to have an open casket so the public could see what they'd done to her baby's face. In September, there was a murder trial where the jurors drank beer and wore guns during the trial. The defense was that they couldn't prove the body was Emmett Till's because it couldn't be identified. They questioned whether Emmett Till was even dead. On September 23rd of 1955, an all-white, all-male jury acquitted both defendants in 67 minutes. One juror commented afterwards that if they hadn't stopped, this is a quote, if we hadn't stopped to drink pop, it wouldn't have taken that long. Mamie was told afterwards that one reason they lost the case was that she didn't cry hard enough on the stand when she testified. In November, a grand jury declined to indict the two men for kidnapping Emmett Till, even though they admitted to kidnapping him. Emmett Till should have never been born, because if African slaves had not been brought to America, he never would have been. Emmett's story actually begins in 1607, when some illegal white aliens and a little brown girl named Pocahontas set the stage for American slavery. In 1607, John Smith, a white man, and 100 illegal white immigrants sailed from England to the shores of Powhatan Native Island lands in what we now call Virginia. They set up a camp on this land, and they called it Jamestown Settlement. These people came looking for gold and other goodies to send back to England, but amazingly, they did not know how to farm or gather supplies and resources, so they pretty much started starving. John Smith got caught up in the Powhatan legal system and was sentenced to death on trumped-up charges. His execution was stayed at the very last minute by a young Powhatan government representative that you know as Pocahontas, who argued his case and won his freedom. Pocahontas then went on to help John Smith and the surviving Jamestown settlers from the harsh winter and land. She helped enroll them into multiple Powhatan welfare programs, including welfare, including food and housing, including education. She led agricultural programs that helped the English immigrants learn how to farm and survive in the rugged and harsh land of 1607 Virginia. These welfare programs that these white people took from brown people kept the settlers alive, but just barely. Between 1607 and 1611, there were 4 shipments of supplies and settlers that came to Jamestown. In 1609, John Smith sailed back to England to heal from an injury, and the 3rd supply of settlers and provisions set out for Jamestown from England. They were led by a man named John Rolfe. They stopped in Barbados, where John Rolfe illegally procured tobacco seeds from the domino locals. It was illegal for John Rolfe to buy these seeds. In 1610, John Rolfe made it to Virginia, where he found Jamestown starving and plagued with disease, with only 60 survivors. His supplies helped keep them alive for another few months, while the 4th supply brought an adequate ration for the settlement, and Jamestown was again able to stave off starvation and sickness. In 1613, Pocahontas was kidnapped and encouraged to convert to Christianity, where she was baptized and took the name Rebecca. She soon met John Rolfe, and they married in April of 1614. 8 months later, Pocahontas had a baby. She died 2 years after that of a sickness she developed while sailing the River Thames with Rolfe. He buried Pocahontas in England and went back to Virginia. He took those black market seeds that he stored in the Caribbean. This strain was much higher quality than what was being grown in the colonies. And John Rolfe began to experiment with growing and curing techniques, and his quality tobacco leaf quickly grew in demand. Welcome to August 1916, 1619, Comfort Point, Virginia, 30 miles downriver from Jamestown. It is a full year before the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock. John Rolfe recounted in a letter the arrival of the first enslaved Africans to reach the shores of America. I quote to you what he wrote down. He brought not anything but 20 and odd negroes, which the governor and Cape merchant bought for victuals. I want you to imagine a slave ship carrying dozens of people snatched from the western shores of Africa. They reached the shores of the English colonies. But before they did that, that ship was looted. It was looted and pillaged by two other ships, the White Lion and the Treasurer. These two ships, they took those enslaved victims of war, the ancestors of Emmett Till, and they set off for Virginia. They became separated in the oceans, and by the time the White Lion reached Point Comfort, Virginia, they were in such bad shape that all they had left in cargo were enslaved people who they sold for food and provisions before moving on. A few days later, the Treasurer made it to Point Comfort with a few more slaves. No one knows how many slaves were brought to Virginia, but by the first census they took in March of 1620, before the Plymouth Rock saw a pilgrim, there were 32 recorded Africans, 17 females, 15 males. In the harvest at the end of that year, John Rolfe and the Virginia colony exported 50,000 pounds of tobacco back to England. The profits from the shipment sent back to England were able to save Jamestown and make it thrive. Because tobacco is most profitable when it's grown on stolen land with slaves. John Rolfe set the stage for 4 centuries of American life, government, and culture, and economy. In 1630, the city of Boston was founded in Massachusetts. In 1692, the Salem witch trials began. They began prosecuting women for witchcraft. 1718, 100 years after slaves came to America, New Orleans was founded. In 1752, the Liberty Bell was cracked upon its first ringing. 1770, the Boston Massacre occurred. 1773, the Boston colonists protested the Tea Act with the Boston Tea Party, where they rioted and they destroyed businesses. 1775, the Revolutionary War begins in America with the Declaration of Independence. 157 years after slaves came to this country. The next 85 years of American slavery saw the rise of the abolitionists. People like Sojourner Truth, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman. None of these people were on your money. They sought an end to the Atlantic slave trade and to free the slaves in America. They lit the fuse on the bomb that was the American Civil War. 1787, the Three-Fifths Compromise. black people are counted for purposes of taxation. The South wanted them counted for purposes of representation, but only as 3/5 of a person. 1808, the USA abolishes the slave trade, but leaves existing American slaves in bondage. 1831, a slave named Nat Turner inspired a few dozen slaves from several Virginia plantations to rise up. Nat Turner led 70 freedom fighters to kill 60 white plantation owners over the course of 2 days. Nat Turner and 50 slaves were tried and executed. Racist mobs rioted. They lynched almost 200 more black people. They've been warning us how dangerous black people are since they hung Nat Turner. They've been telling you how dangerous black people are and how their culture is the problem. (1850). Congress passes the Fugitive Slave Act, required all escaped slaves to be returned to their owners and American citizens to cooperate with these captures. 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Became the best-selling book of the 1800s, only being outsold by the Bible. 1857, it is 3 years before Lincoln is elected to his first term. Dred Scott was a Virginia slave. He sued his owner for his freedom in court, and he won it. It didn't matter. They appealed it. They took it all the way to the United States Supreme Court. This is what the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court wrote about Dred Scott. I quote, "These are not my words. A free Negro of the African race whose ancestors were brought to this country and sold as slaves is not a citizen within the meaning of the Constitution of the United States." I quote, "The change in public opinion and feeling in relation to the African race, which has taken place since the adoption of the Constitution, cannot change its construction and meaning, and must be constructed and administered now according to its true meaning and intention when it was first formed and adopted." I quote the Supreme Court Justice, "The Constitution of the United States recognizes slaves as property and pledges the federal government to protect it, and Congress cannot exercise any more authority over property of that description than it may constitutionally exercise over property of any other kind." The Supreme Court Justice of the United States continues, "The language of the Declaration of Independence is equally conclusive, and it begins by declaring that when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation." It then proceeds to say, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among them is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their powers, their just powers, from the consent of the governed. Listen to the words of the Supreme Court Justice of the United States as he talks to a slave in 1857. I'm quoting here. The general words above quoted would seem to embrace the whole human family, and if they were used in a similar instrument at this day, would be so understood. But it is too clear for dispute that the enslaved African race were not intended to be included and formed no part of the people who framed and adopted this declaration. For if the language as understood in that day would embrace them, the conduct of distinguished men who framed the Declaration of Independence would have been utterly and flagrantly inconsistent. Let me repeat. The conduct of the distinguished men who framed the Declaration of Independence would have been utterly and flagrantly inconsistent with the principles they asserted. And instead of the sympathy of mankind, to which they so confidently appeal, they would have deserved and received universal rebuke and reprobation. Unquote. This is the spirit of the Confederacy. It was so very clearly spelled out to the world, and humanity who lived in the USA, they rose up. They said enough was enough. Enough wasn't enough. This break in the country has been characterized as North versus South, the Union versus the Confederacy. It's framed this way to lend credence to these racists and legitimacy to the traitorous people who wanted to own Black Americans so they can make money. The North and the Union were America. They were not the North. They were not the Union. They were the United States of America. The 11 states of the Confederate States of America left America. November 6, 1860, Lincoln is elected, even though 10 states did not include him on the ballot. 6 weeks later, South Carolina seceded from America with these words: by a vote of 169 to 0. South Carolina legislature enacts an ordinance that the Union, now subsisting between South Carolina and other states, under the name the United States of America, is dissolved. January 1861, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas seceded from America. They didn't secede from the Union. They left this country. February 1861. Those states combined to form the Confederate States of America, an entirely different nation. They elected Jefferson Davis as their president. April 12, 1861. Fort Sumter. Confederate forces fired shots at the fort, and the American troops surrendered. This sparked the Civil War. It lasted 4 years. 5 days later, Virginia seceded from America and joined the Confederacy. May and June of 1861, Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee, they followed suit. 1862, Congress outlawed slavery. 1863, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that as of January 1st, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, and shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. 1864, Confederate troops led by General Nathan Bedford Forrest massacred captured African American soldiers at Fort Pillow, Tennessee. 1864, Abraham Lincoln was elected to his second term. General Lee surrendered. The Civil War ended, and the Confederacy of 11 states ended. Lincoln was assassinated 5 days later. But racism refused to die. After the Civil War ended, America was left with 4 million slaves and 11 rebellious states. There was a 10-year period after the Civil War where black people voted, black people were elected, and black people participated in the government. But Reconstruction failed in a decade because of the KKK. Slavery ruled the economy and law in our land for 250 years. The Confederacy lasted 1861 to 1865. That nation existed for 4 years. They pulled their flag off a Capitol House just a couple of months ago. Abraham Lincoln got shot 3 days after wanting to give the vote to black people. All those former Confederate soldiers came home to work as sheriffs and judges and lawyers, police and mayors. They began to use their power to shape and make an insidious series of laws and policies that made it difficult for African Americans to win court cases, ensured they were subject to black codes and work contracts and supervision of white people and slave owners. They did this for the economic benefit of exploiting them for their labor and controlling their behavior. These evil men came back from the Civil War to their homes. They began to use their power to enact black codes across the South as a legal way to ensure black citizens were available as a cheap labor force, absolutely including cheap child labor. Many states required blacks to sign yearly labor contracts, and blacks who refused were arrested and fined. They were forced into unpaid labor camps. They took their voting rights away. They controlled where they could live. They controlled how they could travel. 4 million people, freed slaves, with no land, no money, no education. They made it illegal for them to learn to read. They made it illegal for you to teach them what A sounded like. beaten into their flesh for 250 years before emancipation. The Christmas Eve after the Civil War ended, in Pulaski, Tennessee, the Ku Klux Klan was formed. Merry Christmas, America! The KKK used cowardice, math, and violence to spread their hateful vengeance and their intimidation and their laws to reinfest American government with white supremacy. Black codes evolved into Jim Crow. You've heard of Jim Crow, but I doubt you know what it means. Jim Crow got in your textbooks long ago, and he never died. When you hear Jim Crow, you should think of Tom Rice. Let's back up decades to 1828. A man named Thomas Rice, a white actor, he witnessed a black man singing a song called Jump Jim Crow. He stole this man's song. He used it as inspiration for a minstrel routine based on a character he called Jim Crow. It was a clumsy and mentally deficient character. He put on blackface. He told jokes and sang songs in an exaggerated slave persona. You've used this persona. You've ever used the word massa. That came out of Jim Crow's mouth. This show became an instant hit. And Thomas Rice toured the U.S. Thomas Rice toured Great Britain. This Jim Crow spirit and stereotype was seized upon by the KKK and racists throughout the South. And it soon evolved into a confusing term used to describe the system of anti-black laws that were laid down across America and lasted 100 years into the 1970s. States, counties, cities across America enacted laws, enacted statutes that legalized racial segregation, the right to hold a job, the right to go to school, infested with the insidious stink of Jim Crow. People who stood up to Jim Crow, they were arrested, they were fined, imprisoned, beaten, killed by law enforcement. Many thousands of towns and countries across the United States became sundown towns, where to be caught after dark while black meant your ass was hanging from a tree before dawn. Public parks were forbidden for African Americans to enter. Theaters, restaurants, bus and train stations, water fountains, public restrooms, building entrances, elevators, cemeteries, public pools, phone booths, hospitals, asylums, jails, residential homes for the elderly and handicapped, textbooks, prostitutes, Bibles, marrying between races or even cohabitating were forbidden by law in most southern states.
Now let's jump forward to March 1955. It's 5 months before Emmett Till went to Money, Mississippi. It It was March 2nd, and a young black girl named Claudette Colvin from Montgomery, Alabama was arrested at the age of 15 for refusing to give up her seat to a white woman on a segregated bus. She wrote a letter to the local chapter of the NAACP recounting her ordeal, a letter that found its way to the desk of Rosa Parks, who read Claudette's letter. After Emmett Till was murdered, Rosa Parks took inspiration from that letter to refuse to give up her seat. Claudette literally just sat down and then wrote a letter, and this sparked the Montgomery bus boycott. 1957. It is 100 years after Dred Scott was ruled to be property. Martin Luther King met with 60 black pastors and civil rights leaders from several southern states in Atlanta, Georgia, to coordinate nonviolent protests. 9 black students, known as the Little Rock Nine, are blocked from integrating into Little Rock Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. President Dwight D. Eisenhower eventually sent 1,000 federal troops to escort the students into school. 1960. It is 100 years after Lincoln was elected. 4 African-American college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, refused to leave a Woolworth's whites-only lunch counter without being served. Armed federal marshals escort 6-year-old Ruby Bridges to school in New Orleans. 1963. It is 100 years after emancipation. Approximately 250,000 people take part in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. Alabama's governor stands in the doorway at the University of Alabama to block 2 black students, Vivian Malone and James Hood, from registering. The standoff continued until President John F. Kennedy sent the National Guard to the campus. He was assassinated a few months later. 1964. President Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law, preventing employment discrimination due to race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. Martin Luther King Jr. wins the Nobel Peace Prize. 1965. It is 100 years after the Civil War ended. Malcolm X is assassinated. Martin Luther King and 600 civil rights marchers are attacked by police, racists, and the National Guard on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which was named after a senior Confederate officer who served as an Alabama senator after the Civil War. The bridge remains named after him today. 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated on the balcony of his hotel room in Memphis, Tennessee. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 is passed. It's also known as the Fair Housing Act and provides equal housing opportunity regardless of race, religion, or national origin. This is generally considered the end of Jim Crow laws. Raise your hand if you were born before the 1970s. If your hand is up, you lived during Jim Crow. However, Jim Crow laws only ended in theory. The thin blue line. After a century of people escaping from slavery, South Carolina came up with the idea for slave patrols, and this little mind virus of an idea spread quickly throughout the colonies. Slave patrols were armed posses of white men who monitored local slave populations. They made sure obedience to their sick, twisted system was absolute. They searched out escaped slaves and returned them to their owners. They terrorized the local populace into submission with constant threat of violence. They patrolled rivers. They patrolled roads. They formed a network of discipline for the slaves. It was a racial vigilante system outside the bounds of law for slaves that broke plantation rules. Throughout the 1700s and 1800s, these patrols and the military evolved and merged and infused into the police forces and local sheriffs and deputies who kept the peace with the long double-barreled arm of the law by stopping slave revolts and returning the property to the slave owner after it escaped. Law enforcement has always been fully in charge of enforcing segregation. By the 1880s, all major U.S. cities had police forces, many made up of returned Confederate officers and soldiers who were welcomed back into the United States after the Confederacy ended in 1865. The South cannot rise again because it never fell in the first place. This reign of terror was exposed for all to see in the televised events of the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, when 100 U.S. cities burned after the assassination of Martin Luther King. It was seen in the 1990s when the police beat Rodney King and Los Angeles burned. It was seen again when George Floyd had his life snuffed out. White people make up 3/4 of the population of the United States, but they are only 1/2 the victims who have died at the hands of police. Only 1/8 of the population is black. 1/16 if you count only black males, yet they are 1/3 of the deaths by police. If you want to save the white victims, then you have to save the black ones first. And as soon as we do, we will all have freedom from police brutality. Emmett Till was not the exception. His death is a common death for black people. June 7th, 1998, Jasper, Texas. James Byrd, Jr. was a 49-year-old black American who had his ankles chained to a pickup truck, and he was dragged for 3 miles down an asphalt road by 2 white men. He died about halfway through. His body hit the edge of a culvert and took off his head and his right arm. They dumped his body in front of a black cemetery. Those were the first white men to be sentenced to death for killing a black person in the history of modern Texas. February 26, 2012. Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old boy, was murdered by a racist Karen with a gun who was in a neighborhood watch for a community where Trayvon, like Emmett Till, was visiting his family. His killer continues to profit from his murder today. November 22nd, 2014. Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old boy, was killed while playing in a park by a white police officer after a 911 caller reported a juvenile with a fake gun was pointing it at people. The police officer, who'd been officially deemed an emotionally unstable recruit and unfit for duty, shot Tamir twice with no warning within seconds of arriving at the park. The death was considered justified and reasonable, and the police officer was placed on paid leave, never indicted, and was allowed to resign. July 17, 2014. Eric Garner died in the New York City borough of Staten Island after a New York City police officer put him in an illegal chokehold while arresting him for suspicion of not paying the tax on a single loose cigarette. Multiple officers piled on top of his back while Eric Garner repeated the words, "I can't breathe," 11 times until he died. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide. The officer who choked Garner was not indicted, and it took 5 years to fire him. The man who filmed the killing of Eric Garner was harassed, arrested, and jailed for 5 years. Eric was killed for the suspicion of not paying the tax on a single loose cigarette. July 13th, 2015. Sandra Bland was a 28-year-old African-American woman who was found hanged in a jail cell in Waller County, Texas. A white police officer pulled Sandra over for not using her turn signal to change lanes 3 days earlier. She did not show him the respect he demanded from her, and he dragged her out of her car at taser point. He then pulled her out of the dash cam range and assaulted her and arrested her. Her death was ruled a suicide. July 6th, 2016. Philando Castile, a 22-year-old black man, was fatally shot during a traffic stop by a police officer from St. Anthony, Minnesota. He was shot 7 times at point-blank range in front of his children after being asked for identification. This was live-streamed on the internet. The officer was acquitted of a manslaughter charge. August 30th, 2019. Elijah McClain. Elijah McClain was a 23-year-old unarmed American who died after walking down a sidewalk carrying groceries and listening to music when a group of white police officers grabbed Elijah with no provocation, handcuffed him, and held him on the ground for 15 minutes, where paramedics executed him by lethal injection. While his arms were handcuffed behind his back and he was pinned to the ground, they threatened Elijah with a police dog. Then they purposely applied a chokehold to cut off the blood to his brain in order to render him unconscious so they could give him the injection easier. The officers reported to the paramedics that Elijah had attacked them with, quote, incredible, crazy strength, while the coroner reported he was 5'6" and weighed 140 pounds. While choked unconscious and handcuffed by white police on the side of a dirty road, paramedics injected a lethal dose of ketamine into Elijah's body. While they carted his unconscious body to a nearby hospital, he went into cardiac arrest. Later that night, Elijah was pronounced brain dead, and 3 days later, he was removed from life support. Elijah McClain repeatedly told the officers, "I can't breathe." Elijah vomited multiple times, and he apologized to his killers about it with these words, "I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to do that. I can't breathe correctly." Elijah said his very last words with the taste of his vomit in his mouth as police officers laid across his handcuffed arms. "I can't breathe. I have my ID right here. My name is Elijah McClain. That's my house. I was just going home. I'm an introvert. I'm just different. That's all. I'm so sorry. I have no gun. I don't do that stuff. I don't do any fighting. Why are you attacking me? I don't even kill flies. I don't eat meat. But I don't judge people. I don't judge people who do eat meat. All I was trying to do was become better. I will do it. I will do anything. Sacrifice my identity. I'll do it. You are all phenomenal. You are beautiful, and I love you. Try to forgive me. I'm a good Gemini. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Ow, that really hurt. You are all very strong. Teamwork makes the dream work. Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to do that. I just can't breathe correctly." The district attorney determined that none of the officers committed any criminal acts, and no charges were filed against them. 6 months later, the Aurora city manager said that the force applied during the encounter was consistent with training. 4 months after that, photos of these police officers surfaced, showing them near a site where they killed Elijah, reenacting the chokehold they used on him. And while executing an American citizen without charges is consistent with training, bringing a little shame upon the honor of the department by lifting the mask and showing Jim Crow's real face is not. And so the police chief fired 4 officers with these words: October 12th, 2019. Tashiana Jefferson, a 28-year-old black American, was fatally shot through a closed window in her home by a police officer in Fort Worth, Texas, because her front door was open at night. As soon as Tashiana came to the window to see what was going on outside her home, the officer immediately fired at the reflection of his flashlight in the glass, killing her in front of her 8-year-old nephew that she'd been playing video games with at the time. February 2020. Ahmaud Arbery was a 25-year-old unarmed black man. He was fatally shot while jogging. He was chased down by a pickup truck being driven by a law enforcement officer born in the Jim Crow era, who was armed with a .357 Magnum. His 34-year-old son was riding in the back of the pickup truck with a shotgun. Another man in a second car boxed Ahmaud Arbery in and trapped him on the road like a dog and began videotaping. The son shot Ahmaud dead in the street a few seconds later. 4 different prosecutors refused to prosecute these killers, and the murderers were not arrested for 2.5 months after the video of Ahmaud's death went viral. March 2020. Breonna Taylor, a 22-year-old EMT, was fatally shot by 3 plainclothes Louisville, Kentucky police officers who were not wearing body cams. They broke into her apartment at midnight while she slept in her bed and shot 20 rounds at her, killing her. 1 officer was fired months later. No one has been charged in her murder. May 2020. George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man, was killed in Minneapolis, Minnesota, when a white police officer knelt on his neck for 9 minutes while Floyd was handcuffed, face down, and had other officers laying on his body. He begged for his life. He cried out for his mother, and he repeatedly stated, "I can't breathe." In the last 2 minutes of the ordeal, he lay motionless with no pulse. The entire time, onlookers begged the police to get off of Floyd's neck. It took months of riots and protests and burning cities to even get the officers arrested. Jim Crow took Emmett Till. Jim Crow gave us hate. Jim Crow gave us the Civil War. Jim Crow gave America terrorism before America gave the world airplanes. Jim Crow burnt Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, 34 years before he killed Emmett Till. Jim Crow killed JFK. Jim Crow took Malcolm X's name and then his life. Jim Crow took Martin Luther King Jr. and then burned 100 U.S. cities in 1968. I was born 7 years later in 1975. Jim Crow burned L.A. in the 90s. Jim Crow is burning America down around us now. There is not enough blood on earth to settle the score. There's nothing down that path for us. We've been here many times. Antagonistic conversation can only put us farther under the yoke and the knee. Jim Crow will only go away when we teach the truth to each other. We must make a new path. We must break this pattern of hate and violence, or we are doomed to repeat it. But what if the answer is easy? What if we don't need a constitution to change our country? What if we don't need a fistful of fire? What if we don't need votes, or a president, or an amendment, or representatives, or new laws, or less laws? What if we don't even need money? What if all we need is some basic compassion for people who can't breathe? What if saving our nation is as easy as being interested in what John Rolfe did with 30 slaves and some black market tobacco 401 years ago? Rolfe saw 30 slaves being purchased for the price of boat supplies, and in his mind it was free labor to work the stolen fields of Virginia soil with his premium Caribbean tobacco seeds that he broke laws to procure. What if Rolfe had done what Pocahontas did when a boat came to her shore, and she saw humans instead of property and poverty and profit? What if he would have taken them in and fed them and healed them and saved them for the price of boat supplies? Pocahontas kept Jamestown alive through 3 years until Rolfe's stolen black labor and stolen land and stolen tobacco seeds saved Jamestown and birthed this nation we're all so proud of. 1 Indian girl and 30 Negroes. They saved your country. And you wipe your feet on them. What if he had teamed up with them? What if the freed slaves owned some of the plantations they worked? Would those black workers and owners have produced more than 50,000 pounds of tobacco in their first 2 harvests, or less? Would their gratitude at being saved had made them more productive? Would we have lost so many Americans in the Revolutionary War if we had strong, free, black countrymen fighting with us together in honor? Ask yourself these questions. Would there have been the Trail of Tears? Would there have been a civil war? Would the KKK have shaped American law and culture and education for a century? Would there have been a Great Depression? Would Tulsa have burned where the black people were? Would there have been World War I or World War II? Would that man have been as convincing to his people if America had held its black citizens high like the beacon of freedom that they would have been? Would we still have used the atom to shred Japan twice? Where would America be now if 30 black lives had mattered to one man on one afternoon in Virginia 401 years ago? When this video ends, will you invite the ghost of Emmett Till to go with you? Will you willingly march with him down the hall of history for a while? Will you search out and silently observe the humanity in your black neighbors and those you pass in the street? Because I promise you that humanity is there. It's been there this whole time. Jim Crow has just been whispering his tune in our ears and dancing our days away with his stolen song to keep people from seeing it. Maybe if you take the ghost of Emmett Till with you when you go, somebody else can whisper in your ear. And maybe, just maybe, America will start seeing it and put these people at the front of the line so we can all be saved by them once again.